Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports, History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Jeffrey Frank, the author of The Trials of Harry S. Truman, The Extraordinary Presidency of an Ordinary Man. He's written a half dozen books and is a contributor to The New Yorker. Thanks so much for being here, Mr. Frank.
Very nice to be here. Call me Jeff, please.
Sounds good. Jeff, before we start our interview, Jeff, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. The most forgotten happy hour Harry Truman ever had was on April 12th, 1945. As a creature of the Senate, the vice president was having a few cocktails with the House Speaker, Sam Rayburn, when a call came from the White House. Upon hearing FDR, the man who embodied the presidency, was gone, he said he felt like the moon, sun, stars, and all the planets fell on him, as opposed to just a bale of hay. One 16-year-old diarist wrote at the time, "Hard to believe Truman is now president. President Truman, gee, but it sounds funny." And yet, Truman would go on to serve just under 8 years and go down as a just less than a grade A president. So, Jeff, I want to ask first, what makes a man, in your opinion, ordinary?
Well, I think most people are ordinary. And Truman himself said, "I'm just one of a million." So, I think people who think that they're not ordinary are often sort of strange in a way. But I think ordinary by that I mean someone who grew up really in the heartland of America, grew up in a very unprivileged environment, and someone who basically made it on his own. He's the only modern president who never went to college, and he really is very much an autodidact. He's self-educated, and he is ordinary in the sense that he didn't know, he would say he didn't know fancy people. His wife, Bess, really couldn't stand Washington and really didn't like the fast track of Washington. So in that sense, he was ordinary. And he really was not sort of all that impressed by himself. He could be very funny about people who were impressed by sitting presidents, but he wasn't that impressed by himself. Though he began to understand that he had a big job.
The rest of that diary entry that I just read, by the way, goes like this. "This will be a day remembered by the whole nation. A great man died today, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. What will the world do without this leader? Why couldn't he have lived to see peace? Dear God, let this man have the rest he so needs, for it is for us that this man has passed away. I just can't seem to write what I feel in my heart into full." So that's the diary entry that I wanted to read. How did I get access to this diary? That's because it was written by my grandmother, Grandma Mickey. We found it after she passed a couple of years ago. It's not from your book.
Let me interrupt you. I love sort of finding diary entries of people who were there and who I didn't know. I love this. I wish I had that too. I wish I had it. I would have used it.
Oh man, that would have been exciting. You can put it into the digital copy, which I think you can update time and again.
Reaction to Roosevelt's death. I mean, people were completely nonplussed by it. In Washington, people were being let off at the wrong floor. I mean, in elevators. It was an incredible shock. Probably much like, even though it's probably much like the Kennedy assassination, which also people don't remember very much now. But it's the same sort of upheaval in the national life, and that's what Roosevelt's death. People were really flummoxed by it, thrown by it.
So what was Harry Truman inheriting from FDR, other than, I guess, the right to have the lowest expectations ever when you inherit the presidency from FDR?
He didn't even know what he was going to inherit. He didn't know much about it. He'd been a senator since 1934, but he had no preparation for this job. His contact with Roosevelt, real contact with Roosevelt, consisted of one lunch in August of '44 after Truman was on the ticket. And that was it. When Truman was nominated for the vice presidency, Roosevelt was in the West Coast. Roosevelt didn't even go to his own convention. And Truman did not know a lot. Truman did not know, for example, that we had this thing called an atom bomb.
We're going to get to that at big time.
He'd become a pretty good senator, and so he was able to sort of deal with legislative problems, and within 3 months he had to go to Potsdam, to Berlin, to meet with the other two great leaders of the war, Stalin, the Russian dictator, and Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, both of whom were exhausted by the war. And Truman, and here's this president who neither of them knew, and with only 3 months of experience, and that's what Truman inherited.
Where was World War II? Where was America? And where was the presidency? How much had the presidency changed since FDR took office more than 10 years before?
Well, I mean, America was slowly filling this role of being a world power, world economic power, and a world political power, and this was happening even before the war, but the war settled it. Suddenly, America was the world's superpower, and in a way that has never been seen before or since. It was not only militarily the strongest power; it was economically the strongest power, and in fact, what made it, decisions it made could alter the world in ways that no other nation could have done before. We've never seen anything like it, and that's what Truman inherited too.
One of the most famous, and we're going to get to more of your book, but I want to ask, one of the most famous history books ever written, David McCullough's 992-page Truman, it came out 30 years ago. Hard to believe. I just wanted to ask, is that book, do you believe, still viable and relevant? Were there things you thought needed updating? Or did you find that it just flat out missed certain things, with all due respect to the great David McCullough, of course?
No, I thought that it was a marvelous book, and David McCullough particularly was extraordinarily researched. I mean, he went back and did, I don't know how many generations of Trumans, and so it was so important that was David McCullough's book was Truman to Life. My book is sort of Truman the Presidency. And McCullough certainly covered the presidency, but we covered it in different ways. And I probably put more emphasis on things that you would emphasize with a perspective of 30 years. When you look at it from the difference between 1982 or 2022, I'm sorry, 1992 and 2022 is extraordinary. We see the world differently, and I think that's what I brought to it. I also found lots of things that were new, and but simply seeing it, being able to look at something like the Korean War in a new way, only because we're still learning about the Korean War, how they got into it, how what the role of Russia, what the role of China was, and things like that. And David McCullough didn't dwell on that. And David McCullough didn't dwell on certain things that were probably were embarrassing, that would have been embarrassing to Truman, and did. I mean, Truman's by executive order, he established the Federal Employee Loyalty Program, and McCullough went past that pretty fast. But McCullough was a celebration of Truman, and it was a great celebration of Truman. And everyone should read McCullough's book. It was for all of that.
Yeah, it is a very, very good book. But I was glad to go through another Truman. Take us through a bit of Harry Truman's life. The word haberdashery is no longer used as much as it should be. So take us through the early part of Harry Truman's life. How is he preparing for the presidency without realizing he was preparing for the presidency?
Well, I mean, it's he really, I think the way he prepared for the presidency was by being a really gregarious guy, and I think he didn't really discover he liked politics until he had served. I'm jumping around. He basically grew up on a farm, and he had sort of very almost menial jobs when he was a very young man. He worked at a bank in Kansas City. And then when the family needed him, he moved to Grandview, which was a family homestead. It was a farm out there. And one of the most interesting things I did when I visited Grandview, it was had been shut down for years for repairs. But I met a really good guy, a man who worked for the Interior Department, and he took me through it. And that's when I began to sort of see Truman for the first time as a real person. We walked upstairs, sort of back stairs, and you saw these. First, you looked down, you saw a stove, a wood-burning stove, which was all they had for heat out there. And this was, by the way, this was not a poor family. This farm was doing okay, and you saw how they must have lived. In the summer, they would have baked. In the winter, they would have Missouri winter is could be pretty rough. So he would have to go downstairs. He shared a room with his brother Vivian. They had two beds, one bedpan. You can imagine what they're like. No running water. So they had one bedpan, two beds, day and night. And he lived there for 10 years, plowing the fields and so on. And this was the life that he had until he went to war. He had joined the National Guard in Kansas City, and which he didn't think would ever lead to. He enjoyed it. He had friends there, but suddenly he was shipped off to France, and even though he had very bad eyesight, they saw leadership qualities. He was promoted to captain, and he was in charge of men whose background could not have been less like his. He was in charge of Catholics. This was a Protestant Mason from Missouri, and he got along with them, and they liked him. And in fact, this Battery D that he was with, they stayed together. They would march together for years and years and years. And this was in many ways the most important part of Truman's early life, because he discovered that he could lead men, and he did. And so that was really important. Then that also, after that, he was friendly with a guy named Tom Pendergast, a sort of mildly corrupt or fairly corrupt boss of, Truman was pretty honest, and Pendergast helped him get jobs. He was basically a county judge, though not with any judicial qualifications, and then there was an opening to run for Congress, and then Pendergast reneged on the offer and said, well, there's a chance to run for the Senate, which was a real long shot. And he ran for the Senate in 1934, and he won. He won with the help of a guy named Bob Hannigan, who was the St. Louis city Democratic chairman. So a lot of ballots that may not have been real helped him, but that was politics in 1934. And that got him into it. And he was a senator then, and became a very happy senator. He went to, you mentioned this call that came to him when Roosevelt died. He was in what was called which Sam Rayburn, who became Speaker of the House, it was the Board of Education. People would go to Sam's office and drink bourbon and branch water. Branch water, by the way, was something that came out of the tap, but they called it branch water, and that was Truman's life. And then he got this chance to be vice president on the ticket with Roosevelt, and that was also a default. Roosevelt had two other choices. One of them was Henry Wallace, who was the vice president for 2 terms. I'm sorry, for 1 term, and Roosevelt wanted to be rid of him. Wallace had certain flaws. He was a little flaky. His beliefs were sort of a mixture of Zoroastrianism and Judaism and Christianity and Buddhism and so other things. And he was also suspected of being something of a fellow traveler. He wasn't, but he was extremely maybe over sympathetic to Russia. And the other choice was a guy named James Francis Burns, who had been in Washington a long time. James Francis Burns, a greatly, really fascinating guy. In those days, the idea that here we have a Supreme Court today with all these, almost all Ivy League, they are all Ivy Leaguers, all of them. James Francis Burns never finished high school, and he was on Roosevelt put him on the Supreme Court. And then he which bored Burns silly, and then he'd been in the Senate, and then Roosevelt gave him the chance to sort of run all the war industries, be in charge of pricing and so on, and he became known as the assistant president, and that was the job he held when Roosevelt kind of promised him the vice presidency. He had certain flaws. Labor didn't like him. Black Americans didn't like him because he was a terrible racist. He actually opposed any effort to overturn the lynching laws, and so Truman was chosen by default, and partly because he was a border state guy, and he had also been very successful running this thing called the Truman Committee.
baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
The opening of your book is a lot of fun, and it was pointed out by a friend of the show's, Amy Argetzinger, who was on the show a few months ago talking about her book on the history of Miss America. But she pointed out this on Twitter, and I read it, and I loved it too, so let's read it. You say that he was outwardly a Midwestern striver, a bit too well-dressed in natty suits, fedoras or Stetsons, and two-tone shoes. You then describe his glasses, his face, his complexion, and then one of his earliest jobs as a farmer. My question is just, why did you choose to open the book this way as opposed to with the weather or by setting up a dramatic scene or some kind of irony?
Well, I will, in my defense, or not defense, I believe the first sentence when when Truman became president at the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt. So I think I get into the big question pretty quickly. But yeah, I did want to describe how he looked, how he was, how he seemed, and he was this deeply unprepossessing guy. We always forget that, and even as he becomes bigger in history, he was a terrible personality on the radio. Somebody said comparing after he was on the ticket with Roosevelt, he sounded like someone reading from the Hindustani in translation. He was a terrible campaigner, and the only time he really excelled was when he was kind of winging it in the back of a train or something, and he was kind of making it up in a way.
The first major moment your book takes us through after he's in office is the nuclear bomb. He had no idea this project had been undertaken, which as VP seems a little odd that he wasn't brought in sooner given the enormity of this project and the consequences of it. But you argue the choice had already been made for him. So explain that a little bit. And, what did he have control of when it came to the new nuclear arsenal? And did he make the right choice if there was any part of it that was still his?
Well, technically, he could have called it off. He was the president, and on July 25th, he gave the order to the Pacific Commander, we're going to drop a bomb on Japan. We're going to drop this thing. A bomb had been tested in New Mexico, the so-called Trinity test, on July 16th, and reports of that are quite fascinating. They're in the book, but just the descriptions of the first nuclear test, people were awestruck. By one report, a blind woman saw. I mean, it was that kind of, the light was so extraordinary, and Truman realized he had something. This weapon was there. He had so he didn't have to use it, but in reality, the choice was made for him. It had been in process for years, and it's inconceivable that a president of the United States in war would not use a weapon that could end the war more quickly. And his first responsibility as president was to protect the lives of the soldiers. He was told that that a land war in Japan would cost up to 500,000 lives. It would never have happened. Best estimates are nothing close to that. But nevertheless, it didn't. Even if it was 10,000 lives, Truman was faced with his choice, and as president, he had to go along with it. It was his decision, of course, but his real decision, his big decision, as far as I can see, was not to drop the bomb on Kyoto, this beautiful city of shrines and so on. Secretary of War Simpson said, "Don't do it," actually Kyoto had been the first choice of what was called the Target Committee, because they said quite rightly it would have really demoralized Japan.
And you also said that there was some intelligence that he didn't even have access to, that Japan was sort of on the verge of collapse, and he didn't find that out until after the bombs had been dropped and the war was over.
Yeah, I think the word was pretty. There was a real report that Japan was on the ropes, but it was pretty clear that Japan was just not going to surrender, but they were done for. They were really done for. We were firebombing Tokyo already, and there were I think 1 million refugees. Japan was destroyed pretty much, and in a way, the Hiroshima bomb was actually much less punishing than what had been going with the firebombing.
How did he learn the nuances of politics and develop the instinct of a politician? One of the interesting things that I thought that you pointed out in the book that I thought was fascinating is that he didn't want to have to answer questions about the nuclear tests while he was with Stalin. And that to me just showed, a real thoughtful and engaged effort to make sure that he was considering many different sides of how different things could be viewed. In other words, he wasn't bashing his way through the political China shop. How did he develop those instincts as a politician so early on in his presidency?
Well, he learned in Missouri, and I mentioned Boss Pendergast, and Truman actually at one point said that Stalin reminds me of Boss Pendergast, and that was kind of a silly comment. Boss Pendergast was a classic political boss. Stalin was a homicidal, but Truman never really understood that, or at least never said so. Truman always seemed to think that Stalin was a pretty good guy, and that the Politburo was in charge of everything. And but when he did learn, he learned how to deal with people. And Pendergast and being in Washington and being a senator, that's what taught him, and he got along with everybody.
What was a day in Truman's White House like? And I ask because many people point to the FDR period administration as the time when the presidency grew to such largesse that it was so sort of no longer capable or no longer possible for one man to even control it anymore, because there were so many jobs that a president had to do, and there was new security, and there were all these staff members and these aides, and it wasn't, we weren't just running a tiny little storefront anymore as the United States. This has been now a big, giant, powerful nation. So what was a day like for Harry Truman? What would a routine day have looked like if there was such thing?
By the way, that's of course why Roosevelt got James Burns to basically be the assistant president. It was too much. Roosevelt took care of the war. Jimmy Burns, he was called Jimmy. Jimmy Burns took care of the country. Truman was a very organized guy. He had regular cabinet meetings, and he listened to them, and he often deferred to his cabinet. And there wasn't. After Germany surrendered and after Japan surrendered, he could focus on other things. He could focus on. He became an advocate of health insurance in a way. He thought that would have been something that Roosevelt couldn't do. He could do that. He didn't, but he tried. He tried and tried again. And he was it was a day of routines. It was also a day of nonstop. Being president is a horrible job in many ways. and you have to be. Eisenhower said it's constant pounding. And Eisenhower, when you think of him as this grandfatherly guy, he was 62 when he ran. Truman was 60 when Roosevelt died. And even so, it was a constant pounding. You never sleep, and there are always crises. And that's what made the job difficult. Suddenly there was a crisis in Berlin. Suddenly things could. Suddenly the Russians had the bomb. There was those constant crisis and then constant personnel problems.
I believe it was Woodrow Wilson who met with, I think, a group of kids or teenagers, and someone said, would you wish, any of them be president one day? And he was like, I would never wish that on anybody. It's too big of a job. I was struck by this moment. You described Truman touring Germany after the fall of Hitler, and you use a quote about how it felt or how he felt it was an example of how men had overreached. This was an example. What happened in Germany is what happens when a dictator really goes too far and is no longer just dictating to his own people, but dictates to lots of people. And I can't help but think of what we're seeing in Ukraine right now regarding Vladimir Putin, the overreach and the devastating consequences of it. Do you want to explain that quote for us and explain what Truman saw in Germany and what his reflections were?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think Truman actually gave it a lot of thought at the time. He just basically, I mean, I don't think he knew all the horrors of what the Nazis had done. Was just slowly coming out. Truman was basically Berlin was rubble, and that's what he saw. And he had when they dropped by when they drove by the Chancellery and saw this, Truman just said, "This is a man reached too far." Putin, I can't understand Putin. I wish that I could. Putin, it makes no. I just don't understand it. I mean, Putin, he was overreaching, but the Russians have done this before. They did it in Afghanistan and got out. Putin doesn't seem to understand that he can't win this thing, and that's what I don't understand. Stalin did win. Stalin won in the Eastern Front, and Hitler, of course, his country was turned into rubble. But Putin, I can't compare them. I mean, I think Putin seems to have a screw loose, if you ask me, because he does. It's a war of choice with no purpose, that I can see.
One of the things you described is that Truman relies on others when it comes to foreign policy. But there's this, the Marshall Plan happens, and NATO happens, and then Korea happens. Is there a particular thing you want to focus on in explaining how we can get the essence of Truman by any one of those two or three things?
Yeah, I mean, interesting. Yeah, that's a really good question, because they're all so different. The Marshall Plan happened sort of without Truman. It was actually General Marshall touring with Charles Bolin, Chip Bolin, and they coming back, and they realized that Europe, again, seeing the rubble of Europe, and it wasn't just Germany. I mean, it was, and that it was really important that Europe, and even possibly even Germany at that point, should be rebuilt. And there's only one way that Europe was going to be rebuilt, and that was with the United States helping. I said something earlier about the United States having sort of unlimited power, unlimited wealth, and this was really, I was really struck by that. I realized, what does a nation with unlimited power, unlimited wealth do? Well, in this case, they did something pretty good. They put this money to sort of trying to rebuild this devastated Europe. Truman was, when Marshall gave his speech at Harvard, he gave it. They basically announced and decided this plan to help Europe help itself. Truman hadn't seen the speech. Marshall apologized to him later and said sorry, and Truman said, "Don't worry about it." And Truman worried about the expense of the thing. Truman saw it as a political problem at first. Then he decided he owned this, and he considered it, and he took credit for it, as he should. I mean, it was his administration. The Korean War was something very different. The Korean War was Truman's decision. I mean, he was pushed into it, but he didn't have to. He had the North had attacked the South, and he understood that we couldn't let that stand. But then he didn't seem to. There were no limits on it for him after a while. The war became a war of. He began to see the Korean War as equivalent to the survival of freedom, of American freedom, and it became an obsession with him in a way that he never really explained. He basically said, "I'm not going to stand for this," and that became and he was encouraged by people like Atchison, Dean Atchison, the Secretary of State, and others, but the big mistake for Truman, and I'm going on now, he agreed with John MacArthur, the Far East commander, to send American troops in to help the South Koreans defend themselves, and that the war was basically a stalemate for a while. The North Korea had almost 90% of the country in control. Then there was John MacArthur had his great victory in September of 1950. The North invasion of the South was in late June 1950. In September of 50, MacArthur had his greatest military triumph, the landing at Incheon, and then the war had turned around. The war was won. This time, finally, the Allied forces, basically America, was in charge, and then it became something else. MacArthur was pushing to to conquer the entire country. My analogy for this, for the Korean War, is in many ways like the first Gulf War. George H.W. Bush wanted to push the Iraqis out of Kuwait, and that was the goal of the war. The Korean War was to push the North Korea north of the 30th parallel, and that was the war. Then it became something else. Then it became Gulf War II to take over the whole country, and it became an extraordinarily devastating war. There were warnings from China, don't do it. Don't cross the 30th parallel with American troops. There were warnings, they were passed through India. And what happened was, it became a war that lasted 3 years. 37,000 Americans died. People call it the forgotten war. It wasn't forgotten by those families. I don't know, the number of dead from Chinese, probably well over 1 million, hundreds of thousands of Koreans, and the complete destruction of North Korea. Every village, every town burned, which is may explain why the hatred of North Korea feels for us. Kim Jong-il is the grandson, of course, of who'd been the leader of North Korea. So that war had huge consequences, and that was Truman's decision. But you can't blame him for it. We've never had a war like that. We've never had a so-called limited war, and that was Truman's. And so Truman had no precedent. So I don't blame him for any of it. But looking back on it, you can see the mistakes that were made.
There's lots of talk right now, and rightfully so, about NATO and the impact of NATO and the relevance of NATO. How did Truman see the development of NATO, and why did he become so committed to it?
That was Truman at his best. Truman, obviously, there again, it wasn't Truman alone, but his advisors, people like Dean Acheson and so on, made the point that some sort of alliance could be useful in sort of stanching the advance, or the potential advance of the Soviet Union. Arthur Vandenberg, the Republican senator from Michigan, who was practiced a sort of a kind of bipartisanship that we never see anymore, had proposed a resolution sort of like this. And NATO, Truman described it at first, it's sort of like a neighborhood watch group. And there were 12 nations originally in NATO, and it was a really good idea. It was an effective idea, and it really did give an umbrella protection for Western Europe, and it was good. And that was Truman at his best.
Domestically, and I guess it's unavoidable that we spend so much time talking about international affairs when it comes to Truman, given that World War II had just ended and the world was kind of reorganized after that. But talk a little bit about domestic politics and domestic issues right now. I mean, the Truman packages up this fair deal. He tries to kind of play off of FDR's New Deal, and there's also Taft-Hartley, and there is, of course, the persistent issue of race and religion in America running all the way through Truman's presidency. So, we could never talk about all of his domestic achievements and domestic issues that he confronted, but pick a couple of them and just explain for us why it's important, and again, what the essence of Truman is as we look through his domestic policies.
Yeah, yes. I think to me the most interesting, of course, I think in terms of expanding the Roosevelt New Deal, it was pretty incremental. His trying to get health insurance was a big deal, but he just didn't get it. I think Truman on race is the most interesting question of all. Truman was by modern terms a bigot. He actually used language that if I were to use it to repeat, I would be canceled. And Truman would certainly had been canceled were he to speak like that today. He was brought up that way. He was brought up in a sort of his family had Confederate ancestry in that part of Missouri, and he actually gave a speech in 1940 where he said the Negro does not want social equality. They want to be they want to be with their own kind. But what he did believe in was equality before the law. What really got him upset in a good way, where suddenly there were all sort of an uptick in brutality against blacks in the South. There was one particular case where Sergeant Woodard, returning from the war, was intentionally blinded by a policeman in South Carolina. And this case had gotten some publicity, and Truman heard about it. But then Orson Welles, who had a regular radio broadcast then, read every single word of Woodward's affidavit about it. And then there were lynchings in the South, and Truman really got to Truman. Truman was a decent guy, and his conscience was affected. And then so he came out and he appeared at the Lincoln Memorial with a man named Walter White, the head of NAACP, with Eleanor Roosevelt, who proposed what today would seem a fairly modest civil rights rule, but at the time it was almost radical, and that's what led to the walkout of the South in the 48 convention. Truman once said, there are two people at this desk. There's the President of the United States and there's Harry Truman. When it came to civil rights and race, it wasn't Harry Truman, it was the president speaking, because Harry Truman was not terribly tolerant of Black Americans.
And how did the desegregation of the military come about?
He gave the order, but that was almost like an afterthought after the South had walked out in 1948. It was actually Eisenhower who made it happen. The military was not desegregated under Truman, but the order was given, and Ike saw it through, and or as much as it could be seen through.
Truman is also the subject of maybe the greatest picture in American political history, which is Dewey defeats Truman. Explain how that picture comes about. And I guess more importantly, it's a story of how an underdog can beat all expectations and come out on top, even when until the last minute, people literally don't think you can win. And there you are holding up the newspaper on the back of the train after what must be considered one of the greatest political campaigns in U.S., if not world history.
It was a great campaign. Truman insisted that he never thought he'd lose. I don't believe that. Of course he thought he'd lose. The polls were overwhelming. Yeah, that paper is very rare, you know. It was only printed early regional edition. So if you have a copy, if you hold on to it, it's actually worth a lot of money.
I actually do not have a copy of that, or I would have been holding it up when we came on the Zoom here.
The Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago has a copy or so for sale. The Truman Museum in Independence has a copy, which is not in very good shape. And so yeah, but they printed these things. And it was amazing. Truman not only had this headline to hold up, but after he won, he could read the Alsop brothers could write, because deadlines were so funny. Joe Alsop, who was a big columnist in those days, could have a column in the Herald Tribune, which must have been written the day before, warning about the problems of having a Republican president-elect and a Democratic president. How do you fly dual control? And there was a lot of talk that Truman should just get out of there early and so on. So, and Truman, it was an extraordinary thing, an extraordinary upset, and Truman, and it was Truman, in the rest of Truman's life, he loved that story himself.
I bet. His farewell address was interesting. You described it a little bit. You say he said, when history says my term of office saw the beginning of the Cold War, but that it also set the course for us to win the Cold War. Do you agree with his assessment of that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's interesting. Is the Cold War over? That's the question we don't know.
Right. We thought it was.
Right. I mean, the Cold War was briefly over in the 1990s, and then sure, that was it. And what's going on now is a Cold War. To change the subject, we're in a very dangerous period right now, sort of flirting with a hot war, which I hope we avoid, and I think we will avoid. But this is something that no one foresaw. No one foresaw this in the era of George H.W. Bush or the era of Gorbachev and Yeltsin. This is extraordinary, and no one saw this because Putin was Yeltsin's guy. Putin was the sponsor of Mayor Sobchak of St. Petersburg, this liberal Democratic mayor in Russia. None of it makes any sense. But we're back to where we started.
Was he along for the ride as president? As president, was he along for the ride as president, or was he shaping events?
Oh, he was shaping events. I think that Truman is considered a dear great president. People forget, because history gives us all amnesia. People forget, as I mentioned earlier, that Truman was a very unprepossessing figure. He was terrible on the radio. He was rarely on television. he's remembered, and is because of the things that happened: NATO, recognition of Israel, beginning of the UN, the Marshall Plan, and these were big things, and this is what Truman's remembered for, and that's why he's so yes, he did shape events, or his administration shaped events. I would give huge credit to Dean Acheson and General George C. Marshall.
Some presidents turn into unhappy warriors by the time they've spent 4 or 8 years. Other presidents say they love the job. Donald Trump, Bill Clinton, both of them loved being in power. Did he like the work? Did he like being president, or was he an unhappy warrior?
He was both. He was totally worn out at the end. He goes, for the first time in his presidency, in the last few months, he was actually hospitalized. He had a very, very nasty flu, and it was so. But one of his doctors said it was much more serious than people realized. He was tired. He was tired. He was making mistakes at his press conferences for the first time, real mistakes. His wife basically begged him not to run again, and also he knew that he couldn't win, so that helped. And so he was also unhappy. He was unhappy. He became unhappy because it was a very unhappy campaign for him in '52 when he supported Governor Adlai Stevenson, who he didn't particularly like, and he found himself. He'd always admired General Eisenhower, the Republican, and then he turned on Eisenhower for all kinds of. He thought Eisenhower lacked a spine, and he really was upset by something Eisenhower did. Well, I'll tell you when Eisenhower had a chance to defend General Marshall when General Marshall was attacked by Senator McCarthy, and he didn't. It was in his speech, and he took it out of the speech, and everyone knew it was there because the advance text was printed in the New York Times, and then Truman didn't say it.
We can all learn from Harry Truman, but what can President Biden learn from Harry Truman's term of office?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. I mean, I think trying to be calm and trying to be firm and trying to be consistent. There's nothing more dangerous than miscalculation. And I think so far Biden has been pretty good about that, and Truman was too. I mean, Truman. You think of the times when we really could have been in a bad shooting war, and that was the times when Russia began to blockade Berlin, and Truman was calm. We had a calm response, and the so-called the Berlin blockade led to the Berlin airlift. By the way, but it's important also to remember that Truman had one huge advantage. We had the bomb, the only country that had the bomb. Biden is dealing with it in a much more dangerous world, and so on. So he can learn to watch out for miscalculations. And Biden also needs to be careful about what he says. Truman would never have called Stalin a war criminal. Truman would never have called. I mean, he would have thought it, but he wouldn't. And he would never have said that Stalin should not be allowed to stay. That sort of thing. Biden, you don't need to say these things. People know how he feels, and this is the kind of thing that Biden. I'm sure his advisors who quickly said he didn't mean it. But Truman made these gaffes sometimes too.
Take us inside the mind of an author. Your previous book is about Dwight Eisenhower and Mamie Eisenhower. Why did you go backwards from Ike to Truman?
It was about Eisenhower and Nixon.
I'm sorry, Eisenhower and Nixon. I may have forgotten that, but why did you go backwards?
Because I found myself writing about Eisenhower and Nixon. Suddenly, Truman was everywhere, and so I felt like I sort of had a head start on it. Also, I love that period. The only thing I was worried about was I didn't have Nixon. Nixon is the greatest character to write about, and Truman doesn't seem all that interesting. It turns out Truman is immensely interesting, but I didn't realize that until I began into it. But that period fascinates me. The post-war period, right up into the 50s. There's nothing like it as far as I'm concerned. Everything happened then, and everything from literature to movies to the McCarthy era, and so on. It's amazing. And I should mention this. I grew up in Washington, and my father worked in the Pentagon for the Department of Defense. He was a civilian in the Department of Defense, and I was even though I never really knew what was going on. The first time I became aware that there was something going on was in 1950. And I had no idea what was going on. I was too little. But suddenly my father was working Saturdays. That was the Korean War.
Hmm.
So I going back to my childhood, which is what going back to my childhood in Washington was kind of fun. I know where everything is. I know where these buildings are. I know what it looks like. I know what it felt like, and that was part of the appeal too.
One of the quotes I love in the book is, affectionate regard cannot alter the past or undo its dreadful misjudgments, but it is bound to affect the outlook of anyone who attempts to revisit a time that was contentious and dangerous, triumphant and tragic. Anyone retelling that story must contend with the immeasurable power of sentimental imagination. Anyone retelling that story must contend with the immeasurable power of sentimental imagination. Why do we have to keep that in mind as we make our political choices today, that our perception of the past may not jive with what was actually happening?
Yeah, I mean the power this power of sentimental imagination is a huge. It's hugely effective. I mean, we just think about how Americans look at Kennedy today. We all, whether you were alive or not in that period, we sort of love Kennedy in a sense. We love the idea of Kennedy, and now we love the idea of Truman. And I think that has an immense power, regardless of what actually happened. And I think in some ways the reverse happens. I suspect that we will not love Donald Trump in 30 years, and I think that kind of that imagination may take a more malign turn. But I could be wrong. I don't know. I mean, the thing about history is we don't know until time passes. We don't know how anything's going to look 50 years from now.
A couple of days ago, this is, I guess, what I spend my time doing, but I listened to some old birthday calls between JFK and Harry Truman, and JFK is in office and Harry Truman is, I guess, in his late 70s or early 80s. And JFK gives him a call to say happy birthday, a nice thing for a president to do, to call another ex-president. And JFK is talking quickly and loudly, and he only allows for very brief responses from Harry Truman. And you can hear as he's hanging up, he's already going on to his next call. What does their difference in style say about the march of history and how things had changed between 1945 and 1960?
Yeah. Listen to the calls between Lyndon Johnson and Truman. Lyndon here, how you doing? Oh, I'm just wanting first thing that you want to give you my very, very best. I mean, it was that whole different style. Yeah, Kennedy was much more businesslike. I don't know. I'm sorry, but Evan, tell me what you.
Yeah, the question is just, what does their difference in style say about the march of history and how things had changed between 1945 and 1960?
Yeah, I mean, the big thing is probably television. I mean, it's a huge difference. I mean, you realize that. The famous story of it. The fact is that the Kennedy-Nixon debates were won by Nixon on the radio, but they were won by Kennedy on television. And I can't imagine Truman doing very well in the television age. Eisenhower was not terribly effective as a speaker, but boy, that smile was pretty good. Truman's Secretary of the Navy, Jim Forrestal, who had real problems of his own, but he said, "Well, Ike, with that puss, you can't miss."
Which president did Truman respect? Which of his predecessors did he respect, and which president who he had, never seen, who in the future would he respect?
Well, Lincoln is the great president. He never had much respect for Roosevelt. He would always say the right thing, but he considered him. He actually didn't much care for Roosevelt. Roosevelt was tried to dump him in 1940. He wanted Truman off the ticket in Missouri, and he said you can be on. So he did not much like Roosevelt. Who would he like to? I think he would have liked. That's a good question. I mean, we haven't had a lot of great presidents since then, have we? He would have. I think he would have probably admired Obama just because of his eloquence and his decency and his. And sort of, I think he might have liked the senior Bush, though perhaps not. I don't know. He wouldn't have cared much. He was very partisan. He wouldn't have liked Reagan. He would have liked Jerry Ford. He would have understood Jerry Ford. He was one of the guys.
Which other giant history tome, with all due respect to the authors, which other giant history tome needs updating?
That's not fair.
You don't have to answer it.
No, I can't think of it. I mean, in American history, there are constant updatings. In case of Kennedy, Fred Logevall has just published the first volume of two.
Really good book. Phenomenal.
Yeah, it's really good. I don't know. I think that takes care of it, at least for the foreseeable future. But there was a very good book about. There's been an updating about Eisenhower. The Age of Eisenhower came out a few years ago. But yeah, I mean, Roosevelt never stops being updated.
Am I allowed to ask who is next for you? Is there going to be a next?
Sure, there will be. I don't know. I don't think I'm going to do another president because I'm sort of blocked each way. I'm not going to go to Roosevelt. I'm not going to go to Kennedy. That's my period. That's my era, 1945 to 1970 or so. And I think some guy named Caro has done.
I think I've heard of him.
Johnson. So
we're all waiting for number 5.
I know.
Lastly, if you could meet Harry Truman, what would you say?
I would be interested in just sort of, I want to hear his stories because he really was a good storyteller. I wouldn't ask him about stuff. He had all his answers sort of down pat. I wouldn't ask him about Hiroshima. I wouldn't ask him about, because he's talked about this stuff, but I would have asked about life in the White House. I would have wondered if he would have talked about his mother-in-law. He never did, but maybe I could have brought it out. He had a very. It wasn't difficult because it very rarely came out of the open. But his relationship with his wife, with Bess's mother, Madge, was strange and strained, and not least because Madge had lived with the shame of having a husband who had committed suicide, and in those days there was the newspapers would report it in great grotesque detail. And
interesting. So you'd meet Harry Truman and ask about his mother-in-law.
I would have asked about his mother-in-law.
Yeah.
Would have asked what was life like in the White House with you and Bess and Margie, who he doted on. We haven't even talked about Margie yet. Margaret, his daughter.
What do you want to say about her? He doted on her, and she wanted to have a career, didn't she, in music?
She did, and she came close. I mean, she was studying hard to be an opera singer. She wasn't quite good enough. She would appear she was on the Ed Sullivan Show, and she was regularly on this. There was a radio program called The Big Show in the 50s. The Tallulah Bankhead was the MC, and she would be on there as a guest singer. She occasionally was on What's My Line, the TV panel show, and she became a Manhattan sophisticate, which is kind of strange to think of. Truman loved visiting her in Manhattan when she married a New York Times editor. They had 4 children, one of whom died in a traffic accident. But Truman doted on her to the end. The parents would call and talk to her every Wednesday from Missouri. He was a real family man, and so I would have talked more about his family.
Charming also to go to Independence, which I've done, and see the silhouettes of Truman around, and to know that reporters used to chase him around in his ex-presidency and ask him questions about the news of the day.
Yeah, it's true. He became a more and more rare sighting because tourists would come hoping for a glimpse of this guy. But no, he lived there, and it was his hometown. And when the library was built, was finally finished in 1956, he was up there regularly. He loved the library, and he had an office there, and occasionally come out and say hello to school children and so on.
Jeffrey Frank, the author of The Trials of Harry S. Truman, The Extraordinary Presidency of an Ordinary Man. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks, Evan. It was my pleasure.
Check out the book. Check out his website, jeffreyfrank.com. He's on Twitter @JeffreyAFrank. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We'll donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram @Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. We'll see you next time. Thanks.